Morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Susan. I'm from the Adler and Allan Marketing Department. And before we kick off our first webinar for 2021, I'd like to encourage you to use the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen to ask questions through the presentation, as we will be answering some of these at the end. In order for us to reply directly to your questions, please could you use your name, otherwise it comes through as anonymous. You can also pause the live event by clicking anywhere on the Teams screen and then clicking again to unpause. I'll now hand over to Simon Tilling and Bill Atkinson to discuss the new REACH legislation.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you to Adler and Allan for inviting me along to join this webinar. Those of you who are following it, we did a number of webinars in 2020 together, and it's great to be back and joining in. Today's topic, of course, being REACH and the new chemicals regime for the UK market. So I'm an environmental lawyer specialising in chemicals and products on the market, and REACH, EU REACH, has been part of my practice for a great many years. We start really, and I think it's important to start here with the question, what is REACH? Now, I'm sure you'll all know it's the EU-wide chemicals regulation, but there's some principles that it's worth reminding ourselves about what REACH is and how radical it was when it came through back in 2007 when it came into force. It was a wholesale change to the way we regulate chemicals in the EU. The burden of proving that chemistry is safe went on to industry as a whole, even for chemicals that had been in use for many decades, and industry was required to provide the data to support the safe use of chemicals, the evaluation of the use of chemicals, with the principle that if there's no data, then no market. You can't put your chemicals on the market unless you have that registration, that data. And registration was just the start of the process. REACH standing for, of course, registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemicals. There's a whole process of looking at the data that is submitted. So it was a radical change, and it cost, quite frankly, the chemicals industry billions of euros. Nobody has quite got an exact figure, but it's certainly greater than 1 billion euros to gather all this data and just play at participating in this EU REACH regulation. It also forced industry to work together. The idea of one substance, one registration meant that competitors putting the same substance on the market had to work together to minimise testing, to share the costs of testing, and to put the dossiers together to register. And then all of this work was done by industry, creating this huge database of information, which sat in Helsinki with the European Chemicals Agency. And then the job of evaluating that and deciding what to do with it, what chemicals to restrict, etc., is a job shared by the European Chemicals Agency and all the competent authorities of the member states. Of course, the driving force of REACH is the precautionary principle, the polluter pays principle, the idea that industry should be the one to prove its chemistry is safe and to substitute better chemistry in the event that chemicals aren't safe. So that's what REACH is. And of course, it's an EU-wide instrument, one of, it should be said, many. And I think this slide just touches on the numerous chemicals regulatory regimes that have been set at EU level. And all of these, of course, set at EU level for a good reason. If you're in a single market with the freedom of movement of goods, which is one of the 4 freedoms of being in the single market, of course, if goods are to move freely, you want your rules set at the market level by the European Union. So all of our chemicals regulations have been set for many years, 40 years, by the European Union at EU level. Of course, all of that changed, and it's obviously changed from the beginning of this year. There's a little bit, and it's worth just having a look at this graphic because it reminds us, we had obviously the referendum back in 2016. We left the European Union just over it. Well, we just had its anniversary, in fact, because we left the European Union on the 31st of January 2020, but we didn't leave the single market then. We had an implementation period where we followed all the rules for chemicals and products that were set by the European Union right up through an implementation period, right up to 11 PM on New Year's Eve, at which point we created two markets. There's a single market remains, but without Great Britain in it. And then we have the market of Great Britain, which is an independent market. And then, of course, we also have Northern Ireland, which is a bit of a hybrid under the Northern Ireland Protocol. So the first question, really, we certainly have an EU reach. Do we have a UK reach, which is the official name for it by government, or is it really a GB reach? And I think correctly, we do talk about the GB, the Great Britain market, because that's where UK reach really bites. If you're in Northern Ireland, a whole host of additional complexities, which we probably haven't got time to get into, but that fundamentally is regulated under the EU reach system. Now, so what have we done? How did we just go from one market to two markets, from an EU reach that we were participating into having our own UK reach? Well, it's simple and it's complex, and I think this slide tries to demonstrate just how complex it gets. The reality is we copied and pasted the reach regulation as it stood at 11 p.m. on New Year's Eve just gone, and put that on our statute book. So that's the easy bit. Everything it said before has been copied and pasted onto the statute book. Of course, the EU can amend reach as it goes on. We're not following that, but we have copied and pasted it, frozen it in time onto the statute book. But that doesn't actually work, of course, because REACH requires you to register with the European Chemicals Agency in Helsinki. Well, that doesn't work for a GB market. So we've had to do quite a lot of new law just to create the GB REACH to be as close to the status quo as we can get it. And that's what all this law is. If you're struggling to find references and finding this whole thing a headache, you're not alone. That's pretty much everybody doing that, including the lawyers. It's a nightmare of numerous different legislative amendments. However, you don't need to worry about that necessarily. Sorry, Susan, if we could just keep on the back slide. The point of showing you this really is to show you there's quite a lot, but just remember it does three things. It puts REACH onto the UK statute book. It amends REACH so that it functions for Great Britain. So where you had references to the European Chemicals Agency, you've got references to the Health and Safety Executive, etc. So it just replicates and creates a GB REACH, but it also, importantly, gives us a time frame for implementing REACH. We need time for our industry to get our head around all the complexities of creating a GB REACH, and that's why we have this transition roadmap. Now, Bill is going to talk us through some of these terms, so I'm not going to dwell on this. But just to notice, one of the important things we've done when we created UK REACH is to give us time to grandfather, to make notifications, and ultimately to make registrations in a timetable that takes us all the way up to October 2027. So we do have a GB REACH. It's functioning today as a matter of law, but we've got time to get our house in order for industry to adjust to the fact that it's now dealing with two markets, not one. And Bill is going to talk us through some of the practical realities of that. So over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Simon. Good morning, everyone. So yes, I think Simon's given a really good grounding there as to the legislative background to where we are now. And as he said, I'd like to go through some of the practical implications of that. What we do within the group, we help to support our clients, and that includes a lot of SMEs in complying with chemical legislation, whether that's around the transport of dangerous goods or whether that is packaging and labelling, and REACH also, of course, comes into that. So yes, complying with REACH. So the starting point, if you haven't already done this, is to really assess your roles within the chemical supply chain, and that may change, of course, as a consequence of that split that Simon was talking about, the creating two markets, separate market within the UK. So the responsibilities within REACH depend on your role. Also, the tonnage band, the responsibilities kick in for above 1 tonne per substance. So if you're blending products together, then of course it's the ingredients we're looking at. So we're considering each of those individual substances. So once you've decided on your roles, of course, and it also then also you need to consider where you're either sourcing chemicals from or supplying chemicals to. You may have to comply with the existing EU REACH if you supply to Europe, or if you're importing chemicals, then you may be affected by a change in role. And Simon's already alluded to this with the downstream user thing, which I'll explain a little bit more about. So the HSE, who have taken over the responsibilities for MECA, as Simon said, they've launched a how to comply with REACH webpage, which is helpful. There's lots of good guidance on there, and will take you and signpost you into the process of starting to register should you are required to do that, basically. But really what you need to start off with, as I say, you really need to assess your operation in terms of your roles in the supply chain, see if anything has changed for you, and then you've then got to make that decision as to whether you have to comply with just the UK system or the EU system or both. Okay, so we'll go on to some examples now of some of those roles. So the first one is exporting from a UK based operation into Europe. And when I say Europe, it's the European Economic Area. So it's all the EU member states, the 27 member states, plus Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, etc. So REACH applies to all of those countries. So if you're exporting above that 1 ton limit that I mentioned, then you have to have a valid registration. As Simon said, no data, no market. So you need that registration. If you already had a registration and you were registered in the UK, then really what you needed to do was transfer that registration before the end of the transition period. If you haven't already done that, it is too late. You would have to then start again. The normal way of doing that, so the registrations would normally take the form of passing that to something called an only representative. So that is an entity based within the European Union that will take on the responsibilities for complying with REACH, EU REACH for you. The only representative has to accept that registration. So if you started it quite late, you have until the end of March 2021 to complete that process. Otherwise, it will be cancelled. So you have that timeline applying as well. So that's an example of exporter. If we go on to another one of the examples, so supplying UK market. So this is looking at registering and complying with UK REACH, or GB REACH, as Simon made the point, really. So there are two scenarios, really, depending on whether you had an EU registration already in place. If you did, then there's a process called grandfathering, and that term is mentioned within the guidance. So what that does is automatically gets you access to UK markets by recognising that you've already gone through the REACH process. And so what you need to do to basically take up the option of grandfathering is to register with HSE. You have to set up a UK REACH IT account and get a registration number. And you have to do that, and that's one of the points on Simon's timeline that he outlined there. So you have until the 30th of April to complete that initial registration process. That's just getting the registration number. Then the full registration follows, and the timetable for that depends on the hazards of the substances that you're dealing with. The 2-year timeline is for things which are what they call CMR substances, carcinogenic, toxic reproduction, etc., or they are highly environmentally polluting. So for those of you who look at hazards and labelling, so H400, H410, that kind of thing, or they were candidate list substances at the transition period ended. So that's the shortest kind of 2-year timetable. Everything else, you've got up to 6 years. Then you're into all the issues around data. So there's the registration fees themselves, but also you have to, of course, incur the trouble and the cost of either accessing data. So you have to negotiate with your existing consortium members if you're a member of something called a SIF, a Substance Information Exchange Forum, and you may have to speak to them to get permission to use that data as part of your UK registration. It's also worth making the point that the UK is following the model that ECHA have established of one registration per substance. So if there is more than one supplier of that substance, then you have to work together. That's both a strength and a weakness. It does also provide some mechanism for cost sharing, but it does obviously require those mechanisms to set up. And there are, those systems are embryonic. There'll be a lot more questions, I'm sure, about that as time progresses, but the principle of that will apply. Now, for things like safety data sheets, if you have EU safety data sheets and you want to continue to supply those products to the UK market, they are still valid. So that's good news. However, if you want to supply products into the European market, then of course you need a European address on those safety data sheets. So you would have to update them with either details, as, for example, an only representatives address or some other address that you have established within Europe. Okay, so that's on the UK market. So the other scenario, if you're importing chemicals from Europe, but you weren't registered for REACH, so you were something called perhaps a downstream user, and we'll explain the process for that. Then basically there's a different mechanism that can apply. The other thing is, of course, you may have to start from scratch. If you have to start from scratch, then there's a process for that. So you go onto the HSE website, you submit something called it's an Article 26 inquiry to begin the process. You need a government gateway pass account and password, etc., etc. The other alternative is that your supplier can register or can appoint an only representative within the UK to do that for you. So they can take all of that administrative responsibility off you, but that is down to your supplier to sort out. Of course, you can also change to a UK supplier if you can find one for the same product, and that could be a mechanism. It would be the easiest thing to do if you can find one, but of course that isn't always an option. We know that. So really the choices are that if you're sourcing chemicals from Europe, then your supplier appoints an OR. It's not something you can do, or you register, etc., or you change supplier. So going on to that process for the end users, we'll go on to the next slide. So if you didn't previously have a registration and suddenly find yourself changing role from being a downstream user to an importer, then suddenly the responsibility falls upon you. And we're assuming in this case that an only representative has not been appointed by your supplier. So what the government has said is that to help, and again, to help with that transition, as Simon outlined, you have a period of 300 days, which takes you till October of this year, to submit something called a downstream user import notification, or DUIN. Nice little acronym. It's a spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet has 26 columns in it. Not all of them will necessarily apply to you. However, I think there's quite a lot of information that normally, as a downstream user, you may not have access to. So it's asking for things like purities, spectroscopy data, etc., etc. You're going to have a conversation with your supplier to get that information from them. And it's a question of submitting what you've got, I think, really, for that process. So once you've submitted that, then that process of almost like, if you like, registration begins. It gets you to the same point as either a new registrant or a grandfathering gets you. So that same timeline applies, either 2, 4 or 6 years, depending on the hazards and the tonnage bands that you're in. So that process then kicks in from the end of that first 300 days. So again, there's guidance on that from on the HSE web pages. Okay, so just to summarise, we've explained the background. So Immediate actions, really, you've got those timelines, you've got those deadlines that Simon outlined, and which is to do with either beginning the registration process or registering a DUIN. All of this depends on you understanding where you sit within your supply chain. So both of the substances you've got, where you're sourcing from, where you're supplying to, what tonnage bands, etc. So once you've assessed your roles, and of course you can more than one role may apply to you. So once you've understood those implications, then you're into the next stages. Do you begin a new registration? Do you grandfather? Do you are you dealing with only representatives? You're appointing an only representative in Europe? Are you dealing with an only representative in the UK? All of those issues around data access and of course cost. There are the details of all the fees that are on the website, etc. But yeah, obviously the data access issues are also quite a big thing. That's where we are at the moment. There may be subsequent changes and amendments to REACH, not least as the adaptations to technical progress, etc., come into play. And I think with that, I'm going to hand back to Simon, who's also going to do a bit more horizon scanning.
Thank you, Bill. As Bill said, this is where we are now, and I think that's the most important message from this webinar, and probably the most important message, which Bill emphasised throughout, is to understand where you currently fit in the supply chain, within a role within GB REACH, and make sure that although we do have time, there is a timetable for protecting your interests. Let's make sure that we don't miss out on that opportunity, because time will go very quickly. And I think certainly the grandfathering deadline and the downstream user import notification in October will come round quickly. So that's very much where we are. I'm going to make some general points which are more looking ahead, looking a bit wider. For some of you who are still just grappling with the question of where am I in this brave new world, it may be points you can just have in the back of your mind rather than things you need to deal with front and centre. But I do think it's important just to have these wider picture and horizon scanning thoughts in your mind as you grapple with REACH. Bill has already said about the issues with data sharing, and it's a common complaint, legitimately so, that industry will say we've spent millions and millions of pounds, euros, on REACH compliance with EU REACH. ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency, has a full database of all this information. Why are we starting again? Why do we have to replicate that in GB? And I'm afraid that's just a simple consequence of having our independent regulatory regime as a result of Brexit. We have to have our own independent database. But that does require filling that database right back up again. And as Bill said, all of that information actually belongs to industry. That was the whole ethos of REACH in the first place. It's industry's data. So you do have to go through the laborious process and time-consuming process of making sure you have access to the data, looking at your data sharing agreements, and speaking to the data owners to make sure you do have that data so that you can resubmit it into the GB, the comply with UK REACH IT system, which Bill has talked about. So that is a process you will have to engage with, and I recommend the sooner the better. I've been talking to a lot of European manufacturers who have been rather surprised that all our regime around grandfathering and downstream user import notifications is very much around it's maintaining the status quo for UK business. So if a UK company held a registration, it can benefit from grandfathering. If a UK business has gone from being a downstream user to an importer, then it can make a downstream user import notification. There's nothing really here that is designed to help European businesses who still want to supply into the UK. Clearly their customers can make a downstream user import notification, which helps, and they can appoint only representatives in the UK too. But don't confuse, and I think a lot of people in Europe have done this, confused our provisions for protecting UK business interests with a general phase-in of the sort we had under EU REACH. So under EU REACH, everybody marketing, placing substances on the market had this transitional period. This is very much designed not to replicate that, but to just protect UK businesses that are currently using chemicals. It's very helpful, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't cure all potential niggles that we could have. So again, right back to that point about ensuring you understand where you are in this system. And then just some general points about how actually we're going to run our chemicals regulatory regime now. So registration is first and foremost what we need to deal with, and we've got a long phasing period, or reasonably long phasing period, to get ourselves all registered in the GB market. But REACH is about much more than that. It's about decisions on chemicals. What chemicals should be restricted? What are going to be subject to authorisations? Which should be put on the candidate list for substances of very high concern? All these regulatory decisions that will impact our industry and you, the users and suppliers of chemicals. So how the regulatory regime functions is important, even if it's not the primary question for you right now. And I think I'll just make a few observations here. The Health and Safety Executive is getting skilled up, and it has been recruiting. And the last I heard, they were proud to say they had over 300 staff now in the Chemicals Directorate, which is great. But that compares to over 700 in ECHA. And ECHA is also supported by the other 27 member state competent authorities, so hundreds of other experts around the European Union. So we still have the same amount of data broadly going into our registry, but a smaller resource. So it'll be interesting to see how we make our decisions on chemicals going forward, and how much enforcement and scrutiny there will be. Points to watch as we go forward. The whole appeal process has changed. If you don't like a decision, if you didn't like a decision of the European Chemicals Agency, you took it to their Board of Appeal. If you don't like a decision of our new agency, the Health and Safety Executive, there's a whole rather complex first-tier tribunal system. Not to get into the weeds of that now, but just to keep an eye on the fact that there's going to be quite a difference in how we deliver this regime, which will create divergence. We will start to be seeing different decisions being made in the EU and the UK, which for those with supply chains and products going across both is something you're just going to have to watch. I think politics will become interesting as the Secretary of State takes a prominent role fulfilling scientific decisions on, e.g. authorisation, that the European Commission was taking. I think we will see decisions on chemicals regulations made in the best interests of the GB market, which of course is part of the point of having an independent sovereign system. And Northern Ireland, for those grappling with Northern Ireland, that's a compromise for lots of good reasons. We have a Northern Ireland Protocol under compromise, but that is going to be a particular challenge for those of you dealing with the Northern Ireland market. As I said, the fundamental principle is it's regulated under EU REACH, but crossing boundaries, etc., it's going to create some difficulties going forward. So just watch that if you're in Northern Ireland. If you're not in Northern Ireland, you may be grateful you're not in Northern Ireland at this moment in time, but it is something to be grappled with as we try and work this through. And then one final point, and I do want to leave plenty of opportunity for questions, so I won't dwell on this point either, but I do want to make the point that we have copied and pasted UK REACH, EU REACH into UK law, and essentially what we've got is EU REACH on the UK books. But there is potential for quite significant change to the how of how REACH operates coming forward. REACH has been singled out as the only environmental EU regulation that has been put into the Environment Bill to give government the power through secondary legislation, through regulation, to change quite a lot of the fundamentals of how REACH works. There are protected provisions, so we've been promised that the what of REACH, the aims and principles of REACH, will be protected, but how it's delivered might change, and government is giving itself through the Environment Bill the power to change it relatively easily. I suggest you only give yourself the power to do that if it's seriously on the cards that you might. Now that may well be good news for many of you, as we may be able to simplify some of the more difficult and incoherent elements of REACH. So watch this space. Right now though, everything that Bill and I have been talking about is the law of the land as it sits at the moment. So you have to comply with what we've got. You've got to go through this process. You have to go through working out where you are with the supply chain. But do keep an eye on chemicals regulation going forward, because I don't think we've heard the last of the potential for at least modification to the way we deliver REACH. And as a final note on that, I always find it interesting that when during the referendum campaign back in 2016, Boris Johnson, who of course was leading that at the time, was pressed for one law he objected to from the European Union. The one that he was said to name was REACH. So let's see actually if there is more significant change on the cards for the future. But right now, we've got to deal with what's in front of us. We've got to deal with that practical reality that Bill has talked us through so well. And that's probably where we should focus our questions. So I'll hand back to Susan for a discussion on those issues.
Thank you, Simon. We've had a few questions come in. So question number one, what did the UK-EU trade deal do for the chemicals regulation? Bill?
Kind of allowed to say not a lot. Not as much as I think the chemical industry had hoped. And I mean, the negotiation position, and there were papers put out by the UK government in that there was at one stage, and it was as a result of heavy lobbying by people like the Chemical Industries Association and the Chemical Business Association and so on, that they were looking for membership of ECHA, associate membership of ECHA, which of course didn't happen. Then they were looking for reciprocal recognition of data, and that didn't happen either. So there ended up being some really kind of watery words put in about recognizing each other's data and safety and so on. Law is obviously Simon's raison d'etre and specialism. I don't think have you got anything to add to that?
I share your view entirely on that, Bill. I think the industry's hopes for what we might achieve from a trade deal and what's actually been achieved are quite some way apart. I think I will make a couple of observations. It was the Theresa May's government intention to have associate membership, so that was on the cards once upon a time. But it unfortunately, it has never been on the cards for the Boris Johnson administration, and they always were very clear they wanted a separate regime, because ultimately, if we're part of REACH as associate membership or whatever else, we've got to take the same decisions, we've got to follow the rules, we've got to be subject to the European Chemicals Agency and also the European Court of Justice, which were some red lines in the Boris Johnson government's approach to things. So it hasn't really been on the cards, but I think we've been hopeful that we get some sort of deal. The real deal we wanted as industry is to save the significant cost of just replicating that database. In Helsinki is all the information we need to run this. If we could have just shared it, then it would save a huge amount of this registration costs and trouble for industry. But the political reality is simply that that would be cherry picking from the European Union's perspective, and they didn't want to share a database full of information that in truth belonged to industry, not to the Chemicals Agency anyway. So I always thought it was a difficult ask. I always thought it was right that the industry should lobby for it, because it will be, I think, estimated £1 billion to replicate. Now, whether that figure's right or wrong, but I have heard that figure being used by industry. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money to go through registration again. And who knows what will happen from here on in. But I think at the moment, I would not be holding my breath for something like that to happen. And therefore, I think we are going to have to just knuckle down and get on with registration for a GB market, as Bill and I have outlined.
Absolutely agree with that.
Thank you. Next question from Phil. If a company already imports a substance from a non-EU company which has registered it using an EU-based OR, can the importer grandfather that EU registration? I assume not. Or can they, or should they, create a DUIN? Bill?
Well, I think that's, if you don't own the registration yourself, then the grandfathering process doesn't really apply to you. Simon can again correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my understanding of that is that you would have to apply for a DUIN and go down that route. So you'd obviously have to begin the registration process, unless, of course, your supplier wants to appoint an OR in the UK. So that's another option for them, but then that would be their decision to make.
Yeah, agree entirely, Bill. The grandfathering can only happen if the registration was held by a UK legal entity, and I think the question assumes it's an EU-based, an EU27-based only representative. So if that's right, then unfortunately you are in a position of being an importer without a registration, so it can't be grandfathered. But I think the best, as Bill says, probably the best answer is to engage with the supply chain and encourage the non-EU manufacturer to appoint a UK OR and do the same as they have done for the EU OR. And I know a lot of manufacturers, non-EU manufacturers, third countries outside of GB and EU are doing exactly that. But that's a conversation you need to have. And of course, if they're not prepared to do that because the UK market might be small, then yes, you do need to start to think about downstream user import notifications and your own access to chemicals and where else you can potentially supply them for, and look for maybe UK-based suppliers if available. But of course, that's easier said than done. So absolutely, that triggers a conversation with the supply chain to find out who's doing what and whether the manufacturer, the simplest option for you being the manufacturer, steps in and appoints a UK OR and handles that for you.
Great. Next question. What are the main actions for non-EU located companies who export regularly to the UK?
I think that's a repeat of the last point that Simon has made, really. So they can do one of two things. They can appoint an only representative, or they can support the UK clients, if you like, in registration. So it really just depends on where they want to go with that. Obviously, the easiest thing for the UK-based entity is if they appoint an OR, as Simon has outlined, and they take away the responsibility from the importer. So of course, you can understand there maybe is an advantage to the well, certainly it's an advantage to the UK buyer. It makes life easier, but of course it will also have advantages for the supplier insofar as they keep the clients in the UK. If the responsibility for registration falls to the UK-based entity, i.e. the importer, then of course, you know, as I outlined, you've then got decisions to make as to whether you can source the chemicals elsewhere, or you want to continue with that arrangement and that kind of thing. So really, two options, as I said, appoint an OR or support the UK-based entity in registration.
Yeah, absolutely. Nothing to add to that. Bill's done a thorough job of explaining that one.
If a substance is grandfathered into UK REACH, but a UK company wishes to change the tonnage band under UK REACH, at what stage should this be done? Would it be during the 2nd, 4th or 6th year's registration of the grandfathered substances? Well,
yeah, in essence, really. Obviously, because that timetable does depend on the tonnage bands. If you wanted to change a tonnage band and go up a tonnage band, then please be mindful that, of course, then you could bring forward the timeline for the registration, so you can end up being a shorter time. So it's something to have a look at. But yes, in essence, it is within that time frame. The clock starts ticking when you've gone through the initial registration process, and then that timetable applies depending on the hazards and depending on the tonnage. So yeah, if you do want to change tonnage bands, and of course you can do that during that time. Different fees apply, of course, as well, and again, you know, the fees depend on tonnage band and whether it's a single or joint registration.
great. And then a question for Simon: will the UK scrap REACH and go for a US style approach?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and certainly there's lots of US clients that I'm speaking to who are hopeful that the UK might. But what might I say about crystal ball gazing here? I think a number of things. One, the US has its Toxic Substances Control Act, which is TSCA, which is how it regulates, and it does it on a very much a risk-based approach, which is quite philosophically different to how REACH regulates on an identification of hazards and a full data approach. When you look around the world, lots of other regulatory regimes like Korea are coming online that are influenced by the Brussels REACH approach, and I think actually in a tussle between which way will global chemicals regulation go, I think it's often the case that the most onerous system is the one that leads, because everyone complies with that because they want access to the sizable EU market. Will the UK take the opportunity to do something different? I suspect not, given those pull factors. The US-UK trade deal, which might look quite different to how it might have looked if November's US presidential election had gone a different way. But that might have put some pressure on the UK to do something on REACH. So it remains to be seen exactly how the trade deals that the UK strikes around the world influence its intentions. But I think I'd come back to the fact that the EU-UK trade and cooperation agreement, which of course was agreed on Christmas Eve, and is relatively, as we've already discussed, modest, if that, on success on chemicals, but it does tie the UK down to certain principles like the precautionary principle that underlies REACH. So I think actually if the UK tried to do something quite different, the EU would start to look at the trade and cooperation agreement, and given how important a trading partner the EU is for the UK, I think all of that in the round, I think we'll see tweaks to REACH. I think we will see adjustments and amendments to REACH, but I don't see a fundamental shift of direction of how we regulate chemicals in the UK in any foreseeable timeframe.
Thanks, Simon. If you are now an importer but of articles, what, if any, are your new obligations? Well,
it's actually quite similar to the existing obligations under the EU REACH system. So you have to notify for articles only if they really contain a candidate list substance, and there have to be the criteria for that. So it has to constitute more than, I think it's 0.01%. I think no 0.1%. Sorry, 0.1%, and cumulatively has to be more than 1 ton per year for importation. So if that's the case, if both those criteria apply, then you have to register for EU REACH as it stands. And as Simon said earlier, we've cut and pasted the legislation from the EU system into UK. So the same would apply within the UK. So the same criteria. So articles are normally not covered by REACH, and it's probably worth explaining there is a definition of an article within the REACH regulation. So it normally, within kind of lay terms, it has to take on a form which is integral to its function, if you like. So and whether that's is formed during production, etc. So there is a definition of an article, and I think if you're not sure whether you've got it, what you've got is an article, then it's worth looking at the Q&A section, or getting some further advice. So the Q&A on the ECHO website, or getting some further advice on it. But it really does replicate what is there already.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that, Bill. And I mean, two observations just to add. One, I've had a number of quite interesting cases around exactly where that substance and article line is, because it's in the law, it's not necessarily intuitive. The ECHO guidance is very useful, so if you're trying to work that through, do have a look at that. And in the absence of the HSE doing its own guidance, you can assume the ECHO guidance is broadly what the HSE thinks until it says otherwise. That's certainly not legal advice, and it's not a perfect situation. But the practical reality is there's a huge amount of ECHO guidance out there, which is very useful for these sorts of purposes. But you know, there are articles that or substances that are right on the boundary between the two, and they sometimes do need some careful thought. The other observation is simply that you may be pleased to hear, if you're bringing articles onto the GB market, that the UK had the option to replicate the SCIP database, the Substances of Concern in Products database, which ECHA has now launched as of 5th of January this year, which is where if you have got a candidate list substance, a substance of very high concern in your product above 0.1%, as Bill has said, ECHA are now building up quite a complicated database to record this. For the purpose being, and it's actually in the Waste Framework Directive, the purpose being that those who are reusing and recycling materials can work out whether there's any substances of concern in it. Quite a burdensome process, actually, and a lot of industry have been very critical of the way the SCIP database has been brought through. The UK has not brought that in because it wasn't an obligation that was live of 31 December last year. It only became live of 5th of January. So for a matter of a few days, UK has avoided needing to copy that across. An official government line is that it is thinking about it, but it might do it in a different way. And I think with the backlash from industry about the SCIP database being a very burdensome way of trying to communicate what's in an article down to the waste management industry, I suspect that we won't be in a hurry in the UK to replicate that. So that's a new obligation in the EU this year that if you're in the GB market, you don't have to replicate.
Thanks. I think we'll do two more questions. Question from Jennifer. Has more information been distributed about UK REACH CEIFs, how UK REACH CEIFs are going to be formed? Is this purely within the remit of the substance registrants?
That's a really good question. There are really sparse details that I've been able to glean so far. So yeah, it is. I don't need to watch this space really, but as I said, the principle will continue to apply of one substance, one registration. It is also worth going back a little bit. I think there was a question that might have been missed earlier about the 1 ton limit. So that applies to when we say substance. Substance again, like article, has a definition within the text. So we don't like to use the word chemical because people have there are different connotations of the word chemical. But so a substance would include something like an individual chemical, say like acetone, but a substance would also include a mixture of something, so like diesel or petrol and so on. And you can have substances of variable composition for things like essential oils and that kind of thing. But the principle is it's one entity, if you like. Let's use that word. But yes, in terms of the CEIFs and so on. There's been precious little that I've been able to glean so far. I don't know whether you've been able to pick up more, Simon.
No, I think you're right, Bill, that there's little out there. I think you can rest assured that this is very much a live issue. I've been on a panel with the HSC who have said, look, don't worry, we want a CEIF type arrangement to operate in the UK, and we will be putting registrants together so that there can be a lead registrant and data sharing between the registrants, and but the detail of it will be different to CEIFs is very much a phase-in under EU REACH concept. It will be the same philosophy of it, cooperate, but I think the HSC is still trying to work out how best to facilitate that. But I think we can be assured that we will be getting more from HSC in the near future. At the moment, I think it's making sure its IT system works and everything else is up and running. And of course, we do have a period of time before the actual registrations necessarily need to come in, but not necessarily, because of course somebody new to the market coming in today actually doesn't benefit from a phase-in at all. So they need to know how to become a registrant and who to cooperate with and what CEIF, if we call it that, to join. So so the HSC know that this is a very live issue, that industry are looking at them for some guidance, and it very much is a watch this space, I think.
Thanks. I think we're going to do one more question. Bill and Simon, if you can have a look through the questions and see if there's anything you feel really needs to be addressed now. Otherwise, which one would you like to do, Bill?
So I think the next one was about the 1 ton limit. So if the importation wasn't quite sure if that was import or export. So if the person's based in Australia or, but if the importing is below 1 tonne, then yeah, you're below the threshold for registration at the moment. But of course, obviously that if that changes, then obviously that would you would then need to register. There's also one about grandfathering for an OR there. Which, Simon, do you want to?
Just having a read down the questions and trying to spot them all. This one, Bill, is the can a UK-based OR from EU REACH, so a non-EU company now, grandfather into GB REACH? Yes. So just if I can say this out loud so that I'm actually clear on what I'm saying and I don't cause a lot of confusion. So the OR for EU REACH happened to be a UK-based legal entity. Of course, for EU REACH up until last year, any of the 28 member states could have an OR. Indeed, so the UK was just one choice of where you could have an OR. Now, what would that UK OR have done? It probably would have transferred the registration into an EU 27 OR, because that will protect for the EU market the registration, and then because the UK-based OR had held the registration, then it's eligible for grandfathering. So yes, it can grandfather, and if it still holds the registration, it should grandfather. And even if it has already transferred the registration into the EU 27 to protect it for the EU market, it can still benefit from grandfathering. Slightly complicated answer, it's just because you'll see the subtlety of the question, but that is that I hope explains it. Bill can tell me whether I've garbled that or whether that makes sense to him.
No, absolutely. That was I was going to make exactly the same point, but obviously I was going to say it's an either or, but you know, it kind of or is used in as only representative as well. So if you are a UK-based OR, as Simon says, yes, you can grandfather, but you would have, if that was not transferred, then the EU market has been lost for that OR. So they would any suppliers to the European market would then have to start again, either with a new OR based in the EU. But yeah, for the UK-based entity, absolutely, because you're a UK-based entity, as he says, you can grandfather it in. Yeah.
I think that's all the time that we have today. So I just want to thank Bill and Simon for your time, and thank you to everyone for joining us. We hope it's been valuable. There are a number of questions that didn't get answered, so we will respond directly, and we will post the questions and answers as part of the webinar when it's posted. The recording, a link to the recording will be sent out to everybody. And also, if you have any questions, you can contact Bill and Simon directly using the contact details on the screen. Thank you very much for watching, and keep a lookout for our upcoming webinars, and we hope to see you there.